Judge Logan Patterson arrived at his house from work in the evening. Later on, he was studying when a giant man broke into his house, turning on the security alarm and beat him to death. The police arrived and found his body lying down dead, and shoved a gavel down his throat. The detectives got to the crime scene and discovered fingerprints on the gavel. The fingerprints were examined, and they got an ID on the prints of Vince Chilton, a former U.S. Navy officer. The police went to Vince's address and found Vince's body with a right arm chopped off. Detective Hank discovers a woman's antique watch engraved, and they call Monroe, a horologist, to trace the history of the watch. Monroe checked the watch and discovered that it was glued to stop it at 10:15, March 11th. He made some calls to know who last serviced it and ended up knowing the whole history, and even the recent owner of the watch, Mary Robertson, a retired assistant DA, who used to work with Detective Hank. The police went to Mary's house and found her dead, and her tongue cut off and placed on the scale of justice. Detective Hank knew who the serial killer was.
I know who the killer is.
Hank tells Captain Renault the connection between all the murders and tells them that the killer, Stark, is coming for him next. Detective Nick arrives at his house after work and Stark breaks in and attacks him, asking where Hank was. Stark vogue in front of Nick and he discovers that Nick was a GRIMM, and he was about to kill him when Juliet arrived home and poured hot water on Stark's face, making him to evacuate the place. Detective Nick was admitted to the hospital, and he called Monroe to tell him about the incident, and Monroe rushed to the hospital. Monroe tells Nick that Stark was a Siegbarste, an Olga's creature who carried grudges to the grave, and they were hard to kill. Nick assigned Monroe to go to his aunt's trailer, take the Olga rifle and the Siegbarste gift, the poison that kills the creatures, and he rushed to the trailer. He packed the rifle and the poison and went back to the hospital. Hank heard about Nick in the hospital and Captain Renault tried to stop him, and they all decided to use Hank as bait. Hank went to the hospital and talked with Nick, telling him that he was going to end their grudge between him and Stark. Nick called Monroe to follow Hank with the Olga rifle. Hank drove to an old place, being followed by Stark and Monroe. The two men started fighting and Monroe watched from a distance, preparing the rifle. Stark overpowered Hank in a fist fight, and he was about to crush him with a big stone, when Monroe fired and killed Stark, saving Hank's life. Monroe returned the rifle and called Nick to inform him that everything was now okay. Hank went back to the hospital and told Nick that he didn't know who shot and killed Stark.